Instead, we're going to linger a moment to analyze proof-of-stake consensus from a few angles. I'm going to assume you understand the basics of proof-of-stake for this part, and I'm also going to warn you right up front that we are going to get a little into the weeds here, and this whole section is not going to be very casual-friendly at all. So you might want to jump to the next video chapter if you find yourself getting a little overwhelmed. So first we're going to try and build a case for proof-of-stake over proof-of-work, and then we're going to go ahead and start tearing that case down. You'll recognize some of this case for proof of stake if you follow Vitalik Buterin's blog posts. Part of the security proposition for a good consensus mechanism is that the cost of attack should be greater than the cost of defense. This asymmetry is a basic function of pre-quantum cryptography. To be honest, I'm not sure anyone fully understands the implications of quantum computing to cybersecurity and cryptography just yet. On top of on-chain consensus, there's the very real aspect of social consensus, and the idea that trying to convince the world at large to adopt a compromise chain over the legitimate chain is going to be virtually impossible in the long term. Note that we're talking about attacks here. We'll come back to the idea of simultaneous block generation and forks of that nature later. That social consensus is a slower, long-term mechanism, while on-chain consensus handles everything faster and prevents infinite disagreements between people. With regard to Sybil attacks, some have proposed a model of 3 E's of resistance: entry cost, existence cost, or maintenance cost, but that doesn't start with an E, and exit cost. So proof of work traditionally has no exit cost and has to compensate for with a rising existence cost. Proof of work offers incentives in the form of block rewards to bring this existence cost into being and sets up a race mechanic so that the network naturally grows to increase security and decentralization. This is important because it's very hard to recover from attacks in a proof of work framework, and therefore the size of the network and the consequent cost of attack has to become too big to fail. Aside from the long-term energy consumption concerns, this brings the attack to defense cost essentially even, and simply assumes that nobody will be willing and or able to make the attack. Which had better not happen, because after the first hard fork, where we fork away from ASIC mining back to GPU miners, there's really no chance to repeatedly fork away from attack chains in proof of work. The standard proof of stake answer to this is to introduce an asymmetry between attack cost and defense cost via slashing. Put simply, this is when you take away staked funds if malicious or irrational behavior is detected. Further, protocols can be designed to limit how profitable malicious behavior can be, and they're capable of multiple forks if needed to eliminate the value of stolen funds. However, the idea is to set the cost of such attacks so high and the benefits so low that you would never actually have to utilize this mechanism. On top of this, simply going out and buying a bunch of chains or coins to try and achieve a 51% majority in order to attack a chain doesn't really make a lot of economic sense. Doing so in large enough numbers to make a difference would drive up the price dramatically by, raising buying pressure, lowering selling pressure for a good chunk of holders. In doing so, you'd likely be making so much money from capital gains and staking on top of that, you might as well just participate legitimately in the network. You would eventually be paying way above asking price to accumulate that hoard if you want to get to roughly the 66% you'd want to perform a double spend. And even then, profiting from double spending or shorting the chain is a lot harder in the real world these days than you'd expect. Okay, so that's kind of the basic argument for proof of stake, notably proof of stake without on-chain governance. Next, let's go ahead and introduce some of the principles set forth by Cardano, the chain started by IOHK, well I guess now IOG, Input-Output Global, that has on-chain governance. This is going to kind of resemble the discussion that Dan Olson has about DAOs. Without on-chain governance, malicious behavior has to be a bit more complicated, as for most people, owning large amounts of one asset will simply be seen as overexposure, and attacks will require more technical expertise. But with on-chain governance, all it takes is high enough ownership to legally serve your own interests in any way you want using purely protocol-driven actions. Many criticize this as plutocracy-established proof of stake, whereas other people say that, all proof of stake is plutocracy established. What puts Cardano in the spotlight here is actually that it doesn't have slashing. which is cited as a solution to the nothing at stake problem, which we'll go over shortly when we talk about criticisms of proof of stake. Their thinking is based on formal peer-reviewed research into game theory that suggests that given sufficient decentralization and the establishment of what's called a Nash equilibrium, which we'll explain presently, slashing isn't really necessary. In a Nash equilibrium, there is no incentive for any individual to change their original strategy. Players are assumed to start out not cooperating, and they are assumed to know the strategies of other players. Although in this case, they can really only surmise that each participant in the network will do what profits them the most. Now, one of those assumptions, namely the one that the players are not colluding, can't actually be left as an assumption. That's where sufficient decentralization comes in. Both pool operators and delegators are both rewarded for block production, positively incentivizing everyone involved. At the same time, there's a parameter called K, above which a reward to a single staking pool encounters diminishing returns. This incentivizes large pools. Well, what it ultimately ends up doing is having them cut their own power into multiple pools, with the new smaller pools then receiving less opportunities to produce new blocks and thus being inherently less powerful and profitable. But of course, they still belong to the same owner. There's also no lockup period to staking, so that any malicious behavior by a pool operator can be punished immediately by the community by simply moving to a different pool. They also argue that slashing is regressive. Presenting disproportionate risk to the poor, and halting, where funds are frozen to hedge against bad behavior, hinders use as a currency. This explains some of Cardano's economic setup, but what about its on-chain governance? It basically uses a one coin, one vote quadratic voting scheme. The outlook for this is not very good. Recall that IOG publishes peer-reviewed research on all of their major solutions. They specifically released a paper regarding the egalitarianism of proof of work versus proof of stake, and while they found that economically proof of stake is more egalitarian than proof of work under certain assumptions, they straight up say that blockchain systems are, for the time, plutocratic with regard to one coin, one vote. And this is as good a place as any to start ripping into proof of stake. State-based systems can be easily distorted by governments by simply blocking on-ramps. Restricting fiat to crypto bank transfers are all that it would take in order to stop the chain's growth, leaving only the option to convert back to fiat, producing an environment that is all sell pressure and no buy pressure. Alternatively, if a government simply started accepting a proof-of-stake asset as taxes, they then could turn around and start staking that coin and then gain a controlling share of that on-chain stake over time. Chains with on-chain governance would be particularly susceptible to this tactic, as the government could take over without even trying. At least with proof of work, the government can't selectively shut off the buying of electricity in order to mine new coins into existence. Mixed proof of stake / proof of work solutions like Decred might present solutions to this, but pure proof of stake does not. Proof of stake naturally tends to centralize chains over time, and it's not hard to see why. Those who have the most at stake explicitly gain the most. Now, this tends to happen with proof of work as well via mining rigs a few different ways. So this point is more on a spectrum than a binary thing. Now, this tends to happen with proof of work as well via mining rigs in a few different ways. So this point is more on a spectrum than a binary thing. But on the other side of that, the massive energy savings of proof of stake over proof of work actually allows massive amounts of validation power to be concentrated on a single computer, whereas proof of work remains geographically mobile, no matter how few entities actually own the machines. Also, to be fair to proof of stake here, there are some solutions like, coin age-based validator selection. So there's potential ways around this, but this may not be appropriate for every consensus protocol. In theory, another potential vector of attack for proof of stake chains is what's called slashing sabotage. If you can cause enough staked coins to be slashed simultaneously, the chain would lose quorum and the whole thing would be frozen until some central authority was able to put things right again. Now, we've never actually seen this done, as it's another one that would be very difficult to actually profit from in like a double spend, given that you'd immediately screw the network your wealth is on, but If it was done, it would be catastrophic. We also mentioned the nothing at stake problem earlier, which we'll talk about now in conjunction with the problem of forks. Now, proof of stake consensus protocols are inherently going to be more complicated than proof of work consensus protocols. And this is for a variety of reasons. One shining example of this is how forks are dealt with. In proof of work, the solution for determining which fork is legitimate is actually fairly simple. Let the miners mine, and whichever fork gets the most proved work wins. In proof of work, you no longer have that proven work that you can look at, and you have a new potential security flaw in the form of the nothing at stake problem. Basically, an attacker creates a fork one block before they spend coins, and then they continue to mint only on their chain. As others are incentivized to mint on all possible chains to ensure that they get paid no matter who wins, the double spend chain wins, and the attack is successful. Once again, we've never seen a nothing at stake attack actually done in real life, but it is theoretically possible. Ethereum's Casper consensus mechanism, which is going to be its proof of stake, attempts to solve this by requiring stake to be locked up as like a security deposit of sorts. Time will tell exactly how successful this is going to end up being. But the fact remains, however, that proof of stake has to create more elaborate protocols to deal with its many edge cases in the absence of provable work. Another issue is that at this point we actually have mathematical proof that weak subjectivity is a hard requirement of all proof of stake chains. To quote a forum post by a Stacks user, if a node has been disconnected for a sufficiently long period of time or is bootstrapping and is presented with two conflicting transactional histories, then it's impossible for it to determine which one is the true chain without some external input. This is because it is impossible to know whether or not the committee that validates the chain is majority honest or not. This is because it's impossible to know whether or not the committee that validates the chain is majority honest and not post facto corrupted, i.e. attacker controlled. In practice, this means that the user will have to resolve the conflict out of band, using some a priori knowledge about the honesty of the chain's current committee. This is not the case for proof of work chains, where the valid chain with the most cumulative proof of work is always the true chain. Now, there's ways around this, like the generation of per block consensus hashes, but this is just one more thing in the already long list of things that you have to consider when you're constructing a proof of stake consensus protocol. This doesn't necessarily mean proof of stake is unworkable, just that it's very hard to work. With regard to on-chain governance and the achievement of a Nash equilibrium, one of the main assumptions behind that is that the staking pool operators can only form a single pool. As you probably picked up a moment ago, this is explicitly not how things work. Even on Cardano, the pioneer of this idea, the pool that I use, Goat Stake, has like 3 pools, and they're all called Goat Stake. There's no way around this without revealing the identities of stake pool operators, which some operators do willingly anyway, but not all. And even if you did use a solution like that, there are workarounds, like starting a pool under the name of a family member, or making multiple competing entities that you control and just happen to play nice with each other. A plutocracy will form under all existing on-chain governance structures, and this applies to DAOs as well, so I do agree with that section of the original video. More on this with regard to Cardano, I'll link some sources in the description if you'd like to take a look.
Proof of stake also even more explicitly rewards the wealthy who have the capital to both stake and spend. It's also even more explicitly exclusionary. Ethereum's proposed proof of stake migration has a buy-in of 32 Ether, which at the time of writing is about $130,000. So really only early adopters and the wealthy can actually meaningfully participate for more than just crumb.
Very valid criticism here. Now, it should be noted that you can stake much smaller amounts on exchanges, and there are staking pools that you can use to get in on the staking game. So that barrier to entry isn't directly passed on to smaller investors, and indeed, that is the way it was planned. So we should be aware that there's multiple reasons why this particular scheme was chosen. There are trade-offs between decentralization, finality time, and network overhead. How many validators there are relates to the computational expense of attestation aggregation, and factoring in the plan for 64 shards, they have to be able to ensure consensus and scaling on each shard. They've essentially chosen a solution that aims at low overhead, low finality time, and relatively low base layer decentralization in exchange for staking pool-based decentralization. So they want you to stake, they just want you to do it in a staking pool. However, this necessarily does take power away from those investors all the same, as they cannot have any say at all if they can't pool together at least that much ETH. And if the price goes up from there, which it likely will, that barrier to entry and subsequent abstraction of power will only worsen. This setup strikes me as suboptimal, but I don't really claim to be an expert in the matter. Does this actually provide a good compromise between performance and decentralization? Does betting on staking pools to maintain decentralization and access for poorer participants actually work? Let me know what you think down in the comments.